everyone. Welcome to an in-person talk with audience in Kreisky Forum. Tonight here, welcome to Philoxenia, and I'm very happy to say hello to our guest who came in from London today, Sathnam Sanghera. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's my first time in Vienna, so thank you for having me. It's very exciting. I read the whole Wikipedia entry for Vienna on the plane before I came here, so I'm a world expert now.
Yeah, this is very good because Vienna really has a lot of wonderful sides, and we're not discussing all the bad things that also happened here.
Well, you can mention them. I don't want to be rude as the guest.
Well, you're supposed also to enjoy. You're supposed to enjoy your stay. While on the other hand, we will discuss your book tonight, which has a lot of very interesting facts and figures in it and thoughts, which also resonate, of course, with the history of the Habsburg Empire to a certain extent. So
yes.
I hope we can sort of get into this. But let me first introduce Sathnam properly. In Britain, people know him very, very well. Here, because this book, unfortunately, has not translated yet into German, which is a big mistake we have to tell to all the German and Austrian publishers or Swiss publishers. Empireland. Let me read you actually a few of the nice things that people have said about it. Sathnam Sanghera's new book is nuanced, intelligent, and even entertaining. It is also refreshingly honest, as well as chronicling the familiar sins of empire, particularly in India. The author gives a fair hearing to those who emphasize the more positive aspects of imperial rule. So you can see that Sathnam not only attacks the legacy of the empire, which he also does with a lot of pleasure and furor and facts and figures, but he also talks a lot about how the empire changed your family, your personal story, but also has changed Britain, of course, and what the impact on the society of Britain today is, which I thought was particularly interesting. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, was famous in saying, "I only wish this book had been around when I was in school," because, of course, it also talks a lot about the fact how it was to grow up as people of color in Britain in the sort of, 70s, 60s, some 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all that. Sathnam himself is born to Indian immigrant parents and lived in Wolverhampton, which is outside.
Well pronounced.
Well, sorry, I mean sometimes my German comes through. Outside of Birmingham. And you have been shortlisted for the Costa Book Award twice, for your book, for your memoir, The Boy with the Top Knot, and for your novel, Marriage Material. Empireland, then, which came out last year, was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. And your day job is actually to be a columnist at the Times. You live in London. We live actually not far from each other.
Yeah, and I guess a version of your job. You write columns as well?
I do. I have a Welt-Kolumne in Falter now. So currently I'm mostly writing about, is Putin crazy enough to press the red button or not? So we'll see how that progresses. What are you writing about? Because you don't only do politics.
No, actually I've quit my column for a while to write a sequel to this. And I do TV and radio, I guess, as well. Yeah. But I'm thinking I'm doing a global version of this, looking at how British Empire shaped the world. Yeah. It's quite a big subject.
Yeah, that's very good. Yes. When is that supposed to come out?
I'm going to finish it next year, I guess.
I'm looking forward to that. We'll have you back for that then.
They might translate that into German, perhaps. It's interesting that the two places it has been translated are China and America. The two new empires. Yes. I think they might be interested in what empires do there.
And what they can do wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I think here for an Austrian public, the entire history of the British Empire is known but not heavily researched and not heavily taught also. But what you say in your book is that when you grew up, it was certainly not taught to you. But British Empire.
I find it quite interesting how yeah, in Europe there's so many different empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and how actually it's probably universal issues we have. There's a lot of nostalgia in Britain for empire, even though it's not particularly well taught. And I thought that was just a British thing, but there was a survey done of European nations recently, and it found the British weren't the most nostalgic. They were the second most nostalgic. The most nostalgic were the Dutch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so not the Austrians, but you go to somewhere like Portugal, and God, the nostalgia there for the Portuguese Empire is incredible. Black Lives Matter has not arrived in Portugal, but I think it's quite a natural thing. And I wouldn't say this in the UK because it would get me into trouble, but in Russia, what you've got going on there is nostalgia for empire. There's great nostalgia for the Russian Empire, and also the way Putin is behaving. Obviously, it's very extreme, but that kind of, the fake news thing, the echo chambers, is a version of what the Conservative government tried to do, with Brexit and so on. But I couldn't say that in the UK because I'd be shot. So hopefully, no one British.
Nobody picks it up from here now. But it's interesting what you say, because why nations are nostalgic towards their empires. What do you think is the reason? One thing that comes to mind, for example, in the Russian case, it's probably because everything that came after was a disaster. So the Bolshevik revolution in 1917 led to Stalin, and then Stalin was over, and the Soviet Union wasn't very successful in making people happy. After it finished, you had 10 years of wild, crazy capitalism, kind of trying out democracy, which led to Putin. So Putin now turns out to be a totalitarian leader attacking neighboring countries. So people are sitting there and thinking like maybe the Tsars were sort of, the best version. Similarly, maybe, I don't know why in Holland they would be nostalgic, because they have a pretty solid democratic situation.
Oh God, I can totally understand why they're nostalgic. They're a tiny country. Britain is a tiny country, and yet they controlled a quarter of the planet. That's kind of exciting, isn't it? I can understand why that's exciting. But, I'm Sikh. We're a very small community in India and in Britain, but we had an empire. We were the final empire in India defeated by the English. And we are nostalgic for the Sikh Empire. You won't meet many Sikhs who say that the Sikh Empire was anything other than nice and cosmopolitan and tolerant. It probably wasn't. It was probably violent and intolerant in some respects. So I think it's natural to want to think the best of your empire and to think you were spreading your goodness across the planet. And so I don't think it's surprising.
Well, it depends also what these empires did. And so now the British Empire, as you write in a few of the chapters in your book extensively, has, the image that was portrayed for a long time, English ladies walking around well-dressed and sipping tea, and men
I guess you guys have probably seen the films here, right? Those
Some
kind
of
the Merchant Ivory kind of films of India. I guess you see a version of it now in The English Patient. Was that a hit over here?
Yeah.
Films like that. There's a nostalgic view of that time.
How nice it was,
to be a white person.
Be a white person and colonize others and sort of. But so that is not what really drove the empire. What drove the empire was getting rich from the colonies, basically. Can we put it that bluntly? Well,
the thing is about British Empire, it was everything. It was such complicated things. One of the reasons we don't teach it or talk about it in Britain very much, it's quite a hard thing to get your head around. We'd like to talk about World War II, because that had a clear beginning, clear end, clear morality. We beat the evil racist Germans. And to talk about empire is much more difficult, because it has no clear beginning, no clear end. It had many different forms. Empire was very different in India to the way it was in, say, Egypt or Iraq or America. And so it's hard to generalize about. And the morality is all over the place, because there were obviously good people doing good things within it. But at the same time, there was genocide in Tasmania. Arguably, there were genocides in the Caribbean as well. There was 3 million Africans sent across the Atlantic. So there was real darkness and pain. I think that's another reason the British don't want to talk about it, is because...
They don't like darkness.
No, you don't associate yourself. You see yourself as a good country, right?
Of course.
You want to see yourself as the enemy of Putin, not the country that actually was responsible hundreds of millions of deaths, probably. Famines, massacres. Yeah. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, right?
But so let's be a bit more specific about this. So you write in your book that there were basically two parts, two eras within the British Empire.
Yeah, this is, again, it's quite complicated. I think I was reading very briefly today about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Very short, wasn't it?
Well, it depends where you also define the empire, because of course the Habsburgs had been in power for hundreds of years.
They had their own empire, right?
And then the Hungarian bit was only added on because the Hungarians were adamant that they didn't want to be under Austrian rule.
Well, so it is a bit more complicated, but British Empire is even more complicated because it lasted for up to 400-500 years. So it had one phase which was basically towards America and the Caribbean, and then we lost America, this famous War of Independence, and then we kind of stretched towards the east, and India became the jewel in the crown. And they were very different things. I mean, the 13 colonies were so different to what happened in the 19th century and the early 20th century in India. You can't compare it. But when you look in India, empire, say if you pick a year, 1923, empire in the Punjab compared to empire in Bombay would have been completely different things.
But let's start first with the first part, which sort of the direction America-oriented or Caribbean colonies, which that was the bit with the slave trade, where sort of Britain basically profited from the triangle of sort of ships picking up slaves, bringing them to the plantages, being filled with the products of all these fields, bringing them back to Britain. So that was a very lucrative thing, and the slaves were never in Britain itself.
Yeah, that's the thing. And in America,
which was very clever because people didn't realize.
Yeah, in Britain there's an idea that, I think quite a popular idea, that slavery only happened in America and we weren't involved, and there were no slaves in Britain. There were slaves in Britain because you can find newspaper adverts from owners saying, my slave is lost, can you send him back to my home? Hundreds of those adverts. So they were in Britain, but more importantly, we were deep into slavery in the Caribbean. And I went to Barbados recently, not realizing that that was where the British first discovered what they could do with slavery and sugar. I mean, we didn't invent transatlantic slavery. The Spanish and the Portuguese did it before us. But what we did, we applied it in an industrial way to the sugar industry and made Barbados. I mean, there was one point in Barbados was producing sugar worth more than the entire gold and silver produced by Spain and Portuguese empires, just from sugar. A small island. And we became very, very, very rich from that. And we forget it. And a lot of the houses in Britain, the stately homes we like to walk around, they were built with
financed
slave money, hundreds of billions of pounds.
Yeah. And then the second part after 1730?
Second part was India, with the East India Company. Asia. It's another reason why people struggle to understand the British Empire, because for a large part of it, it was run by companies. And these were they were basically, the East India Company was a company, but it had an army twice the size of the British Army. It's hard to understand that, isn't it? Can you imagine if Google or Facebook had an army? That'd be crazy, wouldn't it? But they were really the precursor of those.
Don't say it aloud. Don't give them ideas.
But they were the equivalent of Google in the sense that if you wanted to make a lot of money, you went and worked for the East India Company. You could make a fortune, but equally you could die very quickly because the death rate was huge for white people in the East. So the East India Company went over to India, started colonizing large parts of India, brought parts of India together that were never together before, like Burma, the Sikh Empire, and basically created the modern idea of India. So in some ways, a lot of British imperialists take the credit for India even existing, But then it became a very different thing. The East India Company became very corrupt, became responsible for terrible famines. It became really unpopular in Britain, and so it basically lost its license, and the British state took over. So Queen Victoria, I think it was in 1858, the British state took over the East India Company, and Queen Victoria, soon afterwards, became the Empress of India. Interestingly, she wasn't made Empress of British Empire. She was only ever the Empress of India.
Why was that? Is that an only...
It's Disraeli's idea, but she had a particular attachment to India. She learnt Hindi. She had black servants, black Asian servants. You watched that film, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yes, Victoria and Abdul, the film.
Yes, I watched that. Is that fiction mostly, or
no? It's based on truth, but I think it's slightly romanticised.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and she, if you go to Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, you'll see that this is where Queen Victoria loved to go on holiday. Entire rooms decorated like an Indian palace with pictures of Indians on the walls. Beautifully done, but very nostalgic. But she herself never went to India. She never left Britain, I think.
Because it was too, just didn't like travelling, or it wasn't done at the time. Also,
it wasn't really done.
Dangerous, never have a monarch back.
It wasn't easy to travel then, but her son travelled, so went over, you know. It was a big deal when he went.
But so she took over from the company because it was too incapable or too corrupt. But did that change the level of enriching the British nation in general?
People argue about this. You know, I'm not an economist. I don't know if anyone in the room is an economist, but trying to understand economics as a non-economist is crazy because you can argue anything. So there's people who argue that most of Britain's industrial wealth and industrial revolution was financed entirely by slavery and the empire. And then there's people who argue we never made a penny. And they just argue. There's no consensus.
I mean, clearly a lot of profit was taken. And it would be futile to say like that was 100%, because obviously Britain developed on the basis of that. You know, the whole industrialization became also so successful because you had all the natural resources coming.
Yeah, I mean, so overall you can argue it, but you can trace individual cities. So why is Bristol so rich? Obviously because of slavery. Why were there so many cotton mills in the north? Where was the cotton coming from? It was picked from slave plantations, or it came from India. And so you can trace the links, you can trace the individuals, the families that became very wealthy. I mean, the Pitt family produced 2 prime ministers. Their wealth came from a diamond, I think it's in the book, that was smuggled, a giant diamond smuggled in a sock into Britain. And that, for 2 centuries, the family wealth came from that diamond. And I mean, there's a couple of, Gladstone, of course, one of our most famous prime ministers in the 19th century. His father was John Gladstone, who made the most money from slavery in the history of Britain. You know, he got the largest amount of compensation when slavery was abolished.
That's also an interesting point. When slavery was abolished, not the slaves were compensated, but the slave owners, in order to make them.
Yeah, a similar thing happened with French and Haiti. Basically, Haiti had to pay France some money, and but yeah, basically 20 million pounds were given to compensate the slave owners, and I think it was equivalent of, I forget, but I think it's 20 billion pounds. It was 40% of the national budget, government budget that year, and we only stopped paying it off in 2015. So if you're British and an adult, you would have paid some money to these slave owners.
Incredible.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And on the day we paid on the day we stopped paying that money, the British government tweeted saying, "Isn't this brilliant? Today we've stopped finished." And it's like, it's not brilliant.
It's like, wow.
It's not brilliant, because they forgot. They were celebrating abolition. They forgot that actually we were paying the slave owners. So that's another thing about the British. They like to talk about abolition, the fact that we banned slavery. They don't want to talk about there's multiple centuries where we made lots of money and sent 3 million people across the Atlantic.
I mean, from the point of view of the white British establishment, we understand where this comes from, because they were slavery was part of the British Empire, of the British society, of the British business model. Then Britain was forced to give up slavery, and then celebrated the fact that it gave up slavery. So what it was hardly mentioned, which I always find astonishing, is that actually the subjects, you know, not only the slaves but also the nations that were colonized, actually had rebellions left, right, and center, which were also not mentioned in this whole abolition process, and celebrating the white people, who the politicians who came in and advocated for abolishing slavery. But they, of course, it was pushed by the resistance within various countries that were colonies, that they had to in the end give it up, right?
Yeah, and the shocking thing I'm finding at the moment as I'm researching my next book is how the British, once they had abolition and they left these countries, they left them with no investment, no money to build schools, to build a health system, a prison system. So no wonder they have problems now. I mean, they're asking for reparations because they've got really screwed up health systems and, you know, crime. You can trace it straight back to slavery. And David Cameron went to Jamaica in 2015 and they wanted an apology for slavery, and he did it. He said, I just expressed mild regret. He said, that wasn't a great time. We should move on. And I'd like to give you some money. And they went, oh, great. What are you going to give us? He gave, I think he gave £15 million to build a new prison so that British Jamaicans could be deported to Jamaica.
Very sweet.
That's nice, isn't it?
Yeah. He had the interests more of Britain than of Jamaica in his mind.
So it continues now.
It continues.
It continues with COVID, you know, the way Jamaica and Barbados were suffering from COVID, and white tourists were still coming unvaccinated, you know, and putting more pressure on their health systems that weren't working. You know?
I mean, another aspect of COVID was also interesting, what you also write in your book, that people suddenly became only now aware of how, you know, deeply integrated people of color are in British society, and also how useful they are, because they are so much more present in the NHS, in the health system, and do all these useful jobs that often white English people, they also do it, but not to that extent if you compare it relatively to the percentage of the population that is Southeast Asian or black or whatever. I mean,
44% of the NHS medical staff are black or Asian. And you can go to parts of Wales where 75% of all the doctors are Indian. But I guess, is that a difference between the Austro-Hungarian Empire in that you didn't colonize? And those people who came here, you didn't have the same reverse immigration?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs were credited as being, you know, they were absolute rulers. They were not democratic, but they were not, they let, to a certain extent, the nations do their thing.
Right.
And they just were not independent. But nobody really, it wasn't so easy to be an independent nation at that point. And at the end of the 19th century, you know, there was already a parliament of the different nations. The people had more influence within. Where
were the nations? Were they around Africa and?
No. But this is more
European.
More European. The Habsburgs were not successful in. They tried a little bit in Mexico, but were kicked out. But there was not a lot of further away conquering.
I guess that's what I was trying to say. I assume that. But these empires, I bet they had some foreign bits.
Yeah.
Even the Welsh, I think, ended up in... Scotland famously tried to colonise, tried to replicate British Empire. But the Welsh, I think, can be found in Argentina.
Yep.
Welsh-speaking. Yeah. People got around in the 19th century.
I mean, people tried to get around, and to a certain extent this was, of course, also due to curiosity. But I find it really interesting, this mixture of criminality and nostalgia that you have till today in Britain. If you think of places like Liberty, where people go. I also go to Liberty, this department store off Regent Street, and you look at this, it's all, everything smells well and looks well, and the cashmere shawls, and this was a part of this.
Where does cashmere come from? Kashmir.
Exactly.
It's Kashmir became popular because Kashmir was a British territory, and I think the Maharaja of Kashmir would send gifts of cashmere shawls to Queen Victoria. It then became fashionable to have cashmere, and then Liberties, set up by a man who was importing textiles from India, became the biggest, most famous store in Britain, didn't it? And the store itself was built, it's a wooden, I don't know if you've been there, but it's a wooden building in the middle of London. It's built from the timbers of an old East India Company ship. I find that amazing. But I was thinking, the other thing I find amazing is the oil companies, because I've been hearing a lot about them in the news lately. Shell was begun by a guy called Marcus Samuel, importing shells just for decoration from the Far East, and turned into a massive oil company. And also the same with, I think, BP. BP was originally Anglo-Persian, because we were involved in Iraq, for reasons of oil 100 years ago, and then we got involved in Iraq again because of oil.
Iran, if it's Persian, yeah.
But yeah, and then Shell merged with the Dutch equivalent company, which is also from an empire. So you have two empires coming together, and now you've got this modern oil company, which is explained entirely by two empires. We forget that.
It's just amazing also to think that, of course, the most toxic resource, because the profit margin is so big, is oil and gas to a certain extent, while cashmere and these things are probably sort of on the lighter side. Diamonds also quite good to have if you colonize.
Of course, yeah, blood diamonds. That's a whole different subject, isn't it? Yeah.
But that also meant, and that's till today, of course, a big debate, and I'm very happy actually to see that it's now coming along nicely, the discussion about if you have to give back the things that were looted, because, throughout the centuries, under the British Empire, but everyone else, and that also the Austrians, of course, also did with pleasure. So all these museums that you have of the national treasures that people have are to a large extent stolen.
I'm going to all the museums tomorrow. I'm going to see how much stuff you guys stole. Was it quite a lot?
Well, we have a few nice
Really?
things.
I'm going to the Imperial Museum. Is that lots of loot in it?
You have to go to the...
CC?
No, the Völkerkunde Museum, that's what it's called. I'll give you the...
Yeah. Oh, okay.
But the Weltmuseum here also has undergone a renovation, so it would have been much more fun, I think, to be there 10 years ago, before they started the renovation, and with a sort of more contemporary context. But
are they in Germany? They're returning loads of stuff.
Yeah.
Are they returning stuff in Austria?
Well, I think there's a debate going on, and this is a debate which is just sort of, it's just fascinating, yeah, because from the Elgin marbles and that you have in Britain, but to all these things where you think, just give it back already. I think nations should really commit to giving things back. I mean, we had in Austria, our struggle actually was less about all the African art or Egyptian or whatever art, but also the restitution of paintings that were stolen from Jewish families by the Nazis.
And those are returned, aren't they? I mean,
well,
there's a program of returning.
It was not voluntarily, and I remember these debates where the conservative government at the beginning of the 2000s was adamant that they wouldn't do it. I remember how the then Prime Minister Schüssel said to me in a debate where I said, you have to give back the Klimt paintings. You can't keep them. I mean, it's wrong. It's just sad for the Belvedere to lose all these beautiful things. Then he said, if we do that, then we open also the debate about the restitution to get back what the Russians took from us to the East and stuff like that. And I said, okay, two wrongs don't make a right. Yeah, so start with one and then have a debate about everything. And in the end, the Austrians had to sort of move a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think the British, though, I'm sure you guys have seen the museums in London. We stole more than anyone else.
Well, you had the opportunity, of course.
Yeah, got there first.
Really.
And so the British Museum also only has 1% of its collection on display.
Yeah.
So when people go, if we return this, we're going to have to return lots of stuff. I'm always like, you can return lots of stuff. We're still going to have 98% of it.
Yeah.
And I had this argument with George Osborne, who's now the chair of the British Museum, former Chancellor. And he said, Sathnam, that's not really fair, because when you say 99% of the stuff is in storage, a lot of that stuff is very small. I'm like, well, the diamond in the crown jewels is very small. Doesn't mean it's not valuable. Doesn't mean a lot to people in India. But yeah, I think you can return stuff, especially nowadays with 3D printing. I think you could recreate the Elgin marbles.
Copies, yeah.
You can see them exactly to the millimeter.
Yeah.
And you could have the good feeling of giving stuff back.
I mean, I remember in Moscow they had in the Pushkin Museum, which was a kind of not only a museum for the nice things that people have and looted. They had most of that actually in the Kremlin, all these gifts that they got and the diamonds. But in the Pushkin Museum they had a big hall because most of the Soviet citizens couldn't travel. So they recreated from gifts from, how's that in English? What you make the cast? A cast. What you make the cast of? What's the
plaster cast?
Plaster.
Plaster cast.
So they had recreated out of plaster everything, like sort of the beautiful entrances of the dome in Milano and everything was there to see for people to come because nobody could ever see the original. And I always think of this and I'm thinking, as you say, 3D printing or plaster, set it up for everyone and give the originals back to the nations, at least there where it also makes sense. You know, some nations maybe don't exist as they did at the time. I don't know. I mean, there's
to be honest, everywhere, I think France, Germany, America, people are giving stuff back. In Britain, there's a law that stops big museums returning things. It's called the British Museums Act, I think in 1953. It legally stops them returning stuff because apparently one of the heads of the British Museum, I think in the 60s or 70s, just started giving stuff away, and they were like, we've got to stop this. But I think we are, of all the nations of the world, the most reluctant to return stuff.
But because it started maybe earlier, that somebody...
I think it's partly because, the East India Company, when it began, it had a museum in the office. It was part of imperialism. Whenever Britain invaded a new place, the British Museum experts went with them to take stuff. Yeah. It's part of our national culture. Also, we have the most famous museums in the world, so we're proud of them. Yeah. So we don't want to give them up.
Well, they are also. I was wondering, the British Museum is just such a magnificent museum, and it's also very well run and has very interesting exhibitions nowadays. Of course, it would change the scene a little bit if you give back, let's say, 10%.
But do you ever listen to what people say? I often listen to foreign tour, and I've seen people cry. I've seen people refuse to go into the India room because they're like, why would we go and see this stolen stuff? You know, it really upsets young people especially, I think, hate to see it.
But you have this scene in your book where this one aristocrat who bought some very important, was it prayer books? And then...
returned them, yeah.
And she returned them when she saw the original, or someone from the family
came. Ethiopian leader, yeah.
And he was in tears and was praying there for the souls of the people who this actually belonged to. And she realized that something was wrong with her just buying these things and having them on display in her salon. And so she scolded actually the people who sold it to her.
She was like, who are these people selling me this stuff?
Yeah.
Give it back. It's like, well, you bought it, but people don't think through how that stuff arrived.
But she was an early one who would follow up, because now I think, as you say, the young generation of Indians now, they don't, British Indians, they don't think that it's a great idea to have this, not give it back. And this whole movement, which has peaked maybe with, or has got this first public entrance into the collective consciousness in the British realm with Black Lives Matter, and this whole movement of fallism, which I'm a big fan of, because I never liked the statues of all these male war leaders, slave traders and racists. I always thought, like, why could we not replace a few of those and put up, suffragettes and pacifists and scientists and all these people who actually contributed positive things to a society? Why do we have still all these monuments for people who were bad for us?
Well, it's worse than that. I was reading something today, and apparently there are more statues in London of animals than there are of black women.
Oh, really?
I think there's twice as many.
What animals? Like, were
There's
people
war,
like horses, or what were people?
Yeah, the animals that died in the war. And so on. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous,
so
isn't it?
Sad.
Yeah.
But let's say, sort of going forward, probably people will now commission more, like we had the suffragette now on Parliament Square. as a beginning of that. But also monuments have become a lot less necessary for public commemoration, I think, because people move in any case to other, have their photographs on their laptops and don't need to go and sit in the square anymore. But do you think that fallism, or this movement that to topple slave traders like Edward Colston in Bristol, is that a moment in time, or will we see that in the end Churchill will be removed from Parliament Square because he was a racist?
I think that won't happen, because I think Churchill's so popular in Britain. But I think the statue thing is interesting, because I wrote my book, I was finishing it as all the statue thing happened, and my editor was like, you should write a chapter on statues. And I started writing it, and I was like, you know what, I don't care. I don't think statues matter as much in terms of legacies, as much as racism, multiculturalism, politics. Statues, most of the time, you don't even notice they're there. They're street furniture, right? And now, it's only now we're waking up to what they signify. They've provoked very interesting debates, but I think statues in themselves aren't interesting. We've had Gary Young, who's a black columnist, arguing that we should get rid of all statues because they're all crap. I like that argument. But also, I like this idea that we should have an annual day in Britain where we throw tomatoes at the statues we don't like. And then it's very therapeutic. We don't get accused of deleting history. Churchill can be cleaned up. But otherwise it turns into this terrible culture war, which we have, which the government loves to play,
Yeah, but there's an argument there to say, like, people who are really awful, imagine you would have still Hitler statues here. Yeah. I mean, of course, you cleanse the street of the really big bad guys, yeah? So if you think, you're shaking your head, not everything is gone that should be gone. Yeah, of course. But sort of, there are levels of what we have. And
what's the controversial one you just mentioned?
You were thinking there were some, because, I, for example, when I was a student, there was already the debate going on, so this is 30 years now, of the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger. He was before the turn of the century, into the beginning of the 20th century. And he actually invented, so to speak, anti-Semitism as a political instrument. So he used it as a weapon and also to motivate people to vote. And that's where Hitler, who was at the time who grew up in this atmosphere in Vienna, got his cultural, teaching.
Yeah.
And when I was a student 30 years ago, I looked from my coffee shop, Café Brückel, on his statue, and I always thought, wow, why do we have to have this here? And so till today, they have a committee that will be discussing with historians and politicians and interest groups and all this. Should it be tilted? Should it be moved into a museum? Should it have an explanation thing? The same thing that happens in the debates in Britain. Nobody listens to me, unfortunately. I don't know why it's so sad. But I would have always sort of moved him into a museum and just put up something, if anything. For me, a field of flowers would be perfect.
Yeah. I think statues, I don't mind if they stay up, I don't mind if they go. But, the Colston statue, the one that was famously of the slave trader in Bristol that was torn down, it's now in a museum. That's much more interesting. Now it's in a museum. Yeah. It was up there for 100 years and no one noticed it. So, yeah. I mean, in India, they put all the imperial statues into a park, and they call it Coronation Park, I think it's called.
Beautiful.
And it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Have you been there?
No, unfortunately not.
I really want to go and see it.
Yeah.
But this is the idea that if you take down statues, you're deleting history. We didn't stop talking about Hitler when we took down his statues.
Of course not.
Or Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
It's normal.
I think that's really a silly argument. I mean, it's just also what symbols society gives itself.
The Romans did it, the Greeks did it.
Of course.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit also about your childhood in Wolverhampton, because it was quite an interesting time, as you also explain in your book. People, were not necessarily clear about the fact that A, you were of course British, you know, born in the country, your parents came, you had the right to be there. How did this influence you? Do you still feel that sometimes? Do you feel you want to lash out and hit back, or would you like more to be, you know, draw back from the debate? And, you know, as an author, you have in your books an interesting equilibrium that you not only point out the bad sides of things, but also like the positive sides that empire brought to many people from the colonized nations, because, you know, people came here for hundreds of years, came to Britain for hundreds of years to get education and take it back to their countries and all sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a very simple point. The reason we have a racially diverse, multicultural society in Britain is that we had a racially diverse, multicultural empire. People were coming from the 1600s onwards. Henry VIII had a black trumpeter. The first Bengali boy was born in 1616, I think. There was an Asian MP in the 1800s. And the people who came in the 1950s came as citizens, because everyone in the empire, because of the 1948 Nationality Act, was made a citizen of Britain. This is a very uncontroversial basic point. But unfortunately, it is still controversial because the dominant narrative in Britain is that brown people came uninvited. They took advantage of British hospitality. They don't really belong there. That's been the dominant narrative of my lifetime. And particularly in my hometown, where Britain's most famous racist, Enoch Powell, was the local MP. And it's the reason why, even now, when I do events, in Britain, there's always someone screaming at me. And this is actually very nice. No one's screaming at me. It's very sedate. It's nice to actually... I've actually stopped doing events in Britain because I've had enough of just people shouting at me. And yet, what I'm saying is
but
just...
what are they shouting about if somebody...
They're shouting about that I'm not being kind enough about British Empire. It really affects them.
Because it gave you such an opportunity.
Yeah, and also...
Be thankful.
I should be thankful, and also there's behind that the idea that white people should tell brown people what to do. That's been a dominant narrative of the 20th century, and arguably it created Brexit. You know, Britain is obsessed with immigration. It's why we're not taking Ukrainian refugees in good numbers, right? We are set up as a state to keep people away. That's what Brexit was about. That's what Enoch Powell was about. It's what our newspapers talk about constantly. I don't know if I suspect you have a similar issue in Austria too, right? It's the right-wing establishment. Yeah. And it's created this fake narrative that we don't belong. And actually, we have relationships going back centuries.
But that was one of the astonishing things about Brexit for all of us, I think, that I viewed Britain as an immigrant society. Because after all, you know, you have 1 million or so people coming from Pakistan, 1 million Indians, you had 1 million Poles at that time, you know, around the referendum. And so, and, you know, all sorts of other, you know, Caribbean immigration, all sorts of people from all over the world. And the British society has this liberal element, which is here a lot less. You know, here the xenophobia was very deeply rooted always, and it was, you know, there are not a lot of people of color here. The immigration came from other places, more Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. But it is quite it was puzzling to me that this liberalism that people have on the one hand in Britain, and people can do what they want, but then again also not, and very restrictive, and it came out in Brexit and turned, of all people, against the very hard-working Polish people who are so important to keep certain parts of the economy running. So what is it? What went wrong there?
Well, I argue it's all about empire. It's basically, we ran a quarter of the planet for at least 100 years, you know, about 100 years. And we went, when that turned into joining the EU, that felt like a demotion. It felt like we went from being in charge, the biggest empire in human history, to being a member of a club of 20-something countries. and it always felt like it was a reversal of our fortunes, and it didn't sit well with us. So that's my theory. People get very cross about that. They say, to be honest, I think there were lots of different reasons for Brexit. It was one factor, the imperial nostalgia. And you see in the way in which the Brexiteers talked about Brexit. You know, you had Nigel Farage saying on Brexit night that we've won this battle without a single shot being fired. This is our Independence Day. This is the language of colonialism.
Yeah.
They saw the EU as the empire, and they saw themselves as colonized. If you be in the British Empire, you see everything through the prism of empire. You're either the colonized or you're the colonizer, and that's the way we saw Europe, unfortunately.
Well, certainly not by accident that Boris Johnson became the Brexit promoter and then Brexit Prime Minister #1, who delivered Brexit, and a hard Brexit at that, because he comes out of this type of school education where people were quoting Kipling as a spare time entertainment, which not everyone, I think, in Britain nowadays would appreciate.
No, and Boris is one of the most imperially nostalgic politicians ever. I mean, he's writing books about Winston Churchill in his spare time, talking about flag-waving pickaninnies. Do you remember what he said about Obama? I think he said something along the lines of, oh, well, Obama's never going to like Britain because he has an ancestress dislike of British Empire, because he had a relative in Kenya. You know, he sees the world through the prism of him. I think he also argued that Africa was better under the British Empire than it is now. And he's in charge. So he's a big part of my argument.
Yes. I mean, my favorite story is when Boris Johnson came to Myanmar and was standing in front of one of these very important sites and was quoting Kipling, saying like, oh, come back, you English soldier. And the British ambassador jumped on him and hissed at him and said like, stop, no, not good, not possible.
It was
and
caught on camera,
on camera by Channel 4 or something, or Sky or something like that. So he definitely lacks a sensitivity that would be more, appropriate for 2022 now.
And then you got Jacob Rees-Mogg, who writes books about imperial figures from Victorian times. They both do similar things. He dresses like he's from Empire, and
But I mean, when I wrote a book about Brexit, and one of the theories I picked up from people like you was that it really shows an identity crisis, and that this completely unnecessary exit of the EU, which hasn't brought any big advantages to date that we know of, except this beautiful
black passport.
Back to the bluish, blackish passport. Sad. But the identity crisis that we could feel, as you say, because Britain never sort of forgave itself for losing the empire, or never forgave the EU that it took Britain in reluctantly, partly, if we talk about the French. But do you feel now that this identity crisis, that at least something good comes out of Brexit, that people do discuss what is the actual place of this middle-sized nuclear power, which is the 6th largest economy of the world, and does that lead to any deeper soul-searching?
I feel like if COVID hadn't happened, there would have been some soul-searching, because we would have seen how we were worse off, and it would have been clear that Brexit hadn't worked. Unfortunately, we've had a global pandemic, and there's been so much bad stuff going on, and now Ukraine. It's distracted everyone from the fact that Brexit's been economic suicide. We've lost trillions of pounds of investment. The economy is doing terribly, but it's been disguised. And politically, the narrative has moved on. Yeah. No one really talks about Brexit anymore, do they?
No, we are all, I think, deeply saddened and sick of it. And that's, of course, to the advantage now of Boris Johnson. Yeah. But he also survived Partygate, which, Brexit was not as dangerous to him as Partygate was probably for a certain point. But so, no soul-searching, but do you think that this entire societal debate over the next, decade or so, with a new generation and opinion makers and people entering the stage, you know, the people who still lived through the empire or came from the empire are sort of on their way out.
It's going to take many decades, unfortunately, but there's a total change with young people. I think Black Lives Matter really took off in Britain. Like, it was huge. And it started like a real interest in colonialism, in history. It's now compulsory to teach, I think, empire and slavery in Wales. It's going to happen in Scotland. I think they're making the curriculum in England more diverse. But that's the Conservative government, so I don't trust them. But things are changing. And it never happened when I was at school. We didn't learn anything about empire. So finally things are slowly changing, partly because kids are going to school and saying, I want to know about this. Why are you teaching me for 4 years about World War I and World War II? And also, when you teach us about those things, you don't mention the empire. The fact that we fought, all these countries and all these people died for this, you know, it's crazy. And all the resources of India and Africa being used to help win World War II, and we never talk about that. The narrative in Britain is we stood alone. We don't even talk about America, frankly, that we won it alone. And that's an absurd narrative, isn't it?
I mean, the sad thing is that the Brexit, of course, also brought this even more into focus, and the cooperation with the European nations is now being run bilaterally, and you always see this almost sad need of Boris Johnson and his government to be seen together with the German Chancellor or the the French president, and always be like, you know, trying to avoid the fact that the European Union representatives are also around. And that, I wonder if this is now fixed in your view to this particular government, and that we just need a change to a Labour government or to a less Brexiteer crazy loony government than we have now.
Well,
would that make a difference in terms of sort of, you know, soul searching, looking into the British identity, and also maybe repairing a little bit the relationship to the European states?
I think Labour are committed to not talking about Brexit. I think they're right, because everyone's bored of it. But frankly, this current government are launching a culture war about empire, you know, protecting statues, attacking the woke, people like me who, you know, say negative things about British history. And so when that stops, that's got to be a good thing, because that is toxic. You know, it creates a narrative that brown people don't really belong. And I never thought I'd see it in Britain, and I can't believe that really intelligent people who I know don't believe it are saying this stuff. They're saying crazy stuff. I mean, Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary, said recently he was going to tie himself to the statue of Nelson in Trafalgar Square to stop it being torn down by the woke. And no one is trying to tear that statue down.
Of course not.
But they like to create the narrative because it makes them look like they're defending the British. So less of that has got to be a good thing. And, you know, the Labour Party have their own problems with identity politics and so on. But there would be a massive improvement from the Conservatives we have at the moment.
Yeah, well, they were born out of this crisis, and if loyalism is also the reason why you become a minister, that's never a good thing. No. If it's Brexit behind it or not. I think we could take some questions from the floor. I think that Sathnam would also like to hear from you or get an idea who you are.
No pressure.
No pressure, people.
You don't have to tell me about yourself.